friends, and welcome to the School Librarian Learning Network podcast. I'm Steve Tatro, also known as Dr. T Loves Books, and I love talking about all things related to school libraries. I may be an old dog, but I'm always trying to learn new tricks. In each episode of the SLLN podcast, I'll chat with a school librarian about a lesson they love. Hopefully, this can be a place for school librarians to get ideas and find new ways to engage with their students and staff. As a good friend likes to say, we're better together. So I hope this podcast will help school librarians connect with and learn from each other. The opinions and ideas shared in this podcast by myself and my guests are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. And because school librarians always strive to be good digital citizens, I cite sources when using material that is not my own. Without further ado, let's get to this week's episode. Hey everybody, we are back once again, and I am super excited that we're getting to talk to Captain Library himself, Tom Bober. Tom, I am so glad you could be with us today. Why don't you do a quick little intro, tell us a little bit about yourself so people know who you are if they are unfamiliar, which I can't imagine, but just in case.
Hey, Steve, good to be with you. My name's Tom Bober. I'm a K-5 librarian in the Clayton School District, which is in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. I've been in my library, I think 13, 14 years now. I think it's 14 years. And all in the same spot, and just couldn't enjoy it more. So, and glad to be with you today, sharing some of the things that we do in the library.
I love when we get to share, because I feel like that's something when we're all in our own little buildings, we don't always get that opportunity. So it's one of the things I love about doing this. So how did you end up in the school library? Was this like a plan from jump, or was this sort of a circuitous path?
This was just kind of an evolution. So I started out teaching 4th and 5th grade, and I did that for a number of years. And I got to a point where I felt like I was doing a lot with tech at the time. And I thought, boy, I could really help a lot more students if I move into more of a tech support role. So I was in 2 different districts, in what was called, in one district, an instructional technology specialist, in another district, an educational technologist. And I was building based, and I was providing both curriculum support as far as technology integration into the curriculum, as well as kind of hardware, software, troubleshooting type of support at the same time. And I did that for a number of years. And I started to really miss working as closely with students around reading as I had when I was in the classroom. And I also felt like I wasn't able to influence the research that they were doing. And this was all at the elementary level, the way that I wanted to, because I was helping more with just getting in and just understanding the databases and web searching, but wasn't necessarily teaching kind of the hows and the whys to research. And both of those things, in my mind at the moment, would be answered by stepping into the librarian role.
Yeah.
And I started to take classes and got my certification. And amazingly, as I was working towards this, the librarian in that same building I was in decided to retire. And I was lucky enough to get that position. And that is still where I am today.
Nice. It seems like a lot of us tend to take a little more of a circuitous path into the library. And it's really interesting when we can bring those different kinds of experiences to the library, because there's just I think you can get a little bit of a different perspective when you kind of have seen different parts of education and then you come into the library.
I love the library community, the school librarian community, because of exactly that, because we each have not only our own interests and personalities, of course, but we also have those unique skill sets that we bring in. And I think that it allows me, at least selfishly, to kind of lean on all of these different wonderful people, because they've got skill sets and experiences that I don't have, and hopefully I'm able to do the same for them. So I think I love the community for that.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I learned more from my PLN than I think I did in any of my certification classes. It's always a pleasure to talk with people and just get ideas, bounce ideas off each other. Speaking of ideas, you're going to be sharing with us a lesson on the 5 types of nonfiction. And I'm just kind of curious, where did this lesson come from? Like, what was the genesis of this?
So this was born completely and utterly out of necessity. So this is several years ago now, around 2018, maybe 2019, as a school, we were having students that would come to the library regularly, especially during the nonfiction reading and writing units that would happen in the classrooms. And I would have students who would come in and they'd say, oh, my teacher says I need to get a nonfiction book. Or the whole class would come in and the teacher would say, hey, everybody get a nonfiction book. And the students would go into the nonfiction section, right? They'd go into the nonfiction section, they'd browse around. And with only that as a guideline, they'd grab something that was interesting to them. Thank goodness.
Yeah.
And they'd check the book out and walk out of the library. And we would have regularly students come back and say, well, my teacher says this isn't a nonfiction book. Well, it was, but it wasn't the kind of nonfiction book that the teacher was wanting the student to check out. And I was confused. I didn't exactly understand. I knew what was being taught in the classroom, but I couldn't really wrap my head around how I could guide the students towards the books that the teachers are wanting for this particular lesson or this particular experience that they were having. And right around that time, and this had actually happened for a couple of years, but I wasn't making much progress. I stew on things a lot. Like I stew on problems for a long time sometimes. And right around that time, in 2018, 2019, Melissa Stewart had an article that came out through School Library Journal, which was, I think, still entitled The 5 Kinds of Nonfiction, or it had something like that in the title. And it went over what she described as 5 essentially like formats of nonfiction. So real quickly, I'll go over them.
Yeah.
What we had were, I'll go through like kind of the easiest to identify to maybe a little more challenging. So one type of nonfiction in her category is active nonfiction that teaches us how to do something. So think like everything from like books to teach us to do origami, to cookbooks, to self-help books. All of that I would qualify under active nonfiction.
Okay.
Browsable nonfiction. At the elementary level, these are the books where you can pick up and open to any page at any time, and you're not hindered by not reading the page before or not reading the page after. You get these little factoids that are all throughout. So you could think like the DK books, if you're those eyewitness books, if you're familiar with those, or the Weird But True books at the elementary level. And as you get up to high school, maybe you're have like chunks of every 2 or 3 pages, but you still have that chunking idea and that things are a little bit maybe disconnected. Sometimes they're themed across the book, and sometimes it's just a collection of facts.
Mm-hmm. So like your Guinness Book of World Records sorts of things.
Absolutely.
And like, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. So then we move into our narrative nonfiction, and those are our story nonfiction books, right? They've got a story arc, a beginning, middle, end. We have main characters. So think of our Steve Schenken books.
Yes.
All of his, I mean, he's kind of quintessential, but also so much of at the elementary level, and I think these belong everywhere, of course, but the historically based nonfiction picture books that often have that narrative arc. They're about an individual or a big event that have that narrative storytelling going on within
maybe like a Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales sort of a storyline.
Yeah,
Not as much. Okay.
I think Melissa Stewart would make the argument that those might be, and I don't want to speak for her, but I feel like I've heard her make that argument that those books might be more informational fiction in her mind because they have that narrator that is fictionalized going through the story. Okay. I have them in my nonfiction section, and I do have them labeled as a narrative nonfiction, but I don't know that everyone necessarily does. But yes, that's where I have them as well. I that whole idea of a fictional narrator in a non giving informational facts is or telling us a true story is a whole different beast, I think. So I don't want to tread in those waters today too much, but I know people talk about it, and I don't. That's where I have them in my nonfiction section. So we have those.
Yep.
We have, and then we've got traditional nonfiction books. And this is what my teachers wanted my students to listen to check out and to be reading for this particular assignment so often. And those are the books that are essentially traditionally organized. They're about a broad topic. They're organized in chapters. They, at the elementary level, typically have engaging photographs with captions, labels, maybe some little fun facts. They're littered throughout there, but kind of this broad overview topic that's organized into chapters and has kind of that flatter voice, you might say, to the writing. It's kind of basic and straightforward.
Okay.
And then the one that I think is the most complex to identify, but also the most interesting, Melissa Stewart describes as expository literature. And that is, if you read any of her books, that's typically what she publishes now. And that is an expository piece. So it's not narrative, but it has a lot of the craft moves, a lot of the writing moves that a narrative piece will have. So when my students study those pieces, they often will say, well, it feels like a story, but it's not a story because there's no story arc, because there's no main character. But it may have a narrator to it that's sharing us information in a very kind of agreeable, enjoyable voice, or it may use different types of poetic attributes that make it feel much more prose-like,
Okay.
or much more novel and verse-like in a sense sometimes. But it's expository. It is simply sharing information. So, for example, Melissa Stewart, I believe this is her newest book, which is about the moon and the impact that it has on different animals, either for finding food or for protecting themselves from predators or for reproductive purposes, all kinds of ways that the moon plays a role in different animals' lives. And so it's informational in that sense. There literally is no story, but the way that she tells that is in kind of a poetic way. And so we describe those books that have that type of feel as an expository literature book. So those are the 5 kinds of nonfiction, and that's my description. Melissa Stewart does a better job. Obviously, it's her piece, and she has a book out on it now. I recommend anyone who's interested in finding out more to look at that, to look at her website. On there, that original SLJ article from 2018 or 2019 is on there. So all of those are really great resources if this type of organization of nonfiction intrigues you.
That's absolutely something I need to pick up and get in my library, is her book on the 5 types of nonfiction. Because
it's really great.
I know you have done this lesson in the past, and we've talked a little bit about it ourselves before, and I have been trying to sort of introduce it in my middle school, and I feel like I am just not quite getting it right. And I feel like I definitely need that extra resource. So I'm really glad we're getting the chance to talk, but also really glad that you're suggesting this as a resource for me to pick up.
Absolutely. And I did a PD with a group of librarians in a neighboring district this past summer. And one thing that I did in preparation for that, because I was working with K through 12 librarians, is I went into not only my library and brought books over to the PD, but I also went to my middle school library and my high school library. And what I found was, sure enough, I could easily find books that fit into each of those 5 categories on the library shelves. So I know that I've been focused on much more of an elementary experience with that, but those same books exist, those same formats of books exist in your high school library and your middle school library, certainly.
Oh yeah, definitely. So you were seeing that this was maybe a little bit of a frustration for the students and maybe for yourself trying to support the teachers when they're sending the students down for nonfiction.
Right.
And you saw this article, it kind of got you to think about, okay, so there's some different ways of looking at this. So you turned it into a lesson. And how does the lesson sort of unfold for the students? I'm imagining they're coming to see you in the library and it goes from there.
So I'll say first that this lesson is not just for the students. This lesson is for the teachers too, because I need the teachers to buy into this. And so this lesson is kind of dual purpose. Now, I'm very lucky, I believe, in that 1st through 5th grade, all of my teachers come into the library with their students. And so it's not a drop off. So anything that I'm doing, my teachers are also experiencing, and I rope them in and involve them as much as I can. If that's not the case, sitting or sharing this information with teachers as well, I think is going to be invaluable. But yes, teachers and their students come in. And I've done this in a variety of different ways, but I just did this in November. I kind of go through a round of doing this at different grade levels. And so we have, for example, 2nd grade coming in, and they come in. We do a sit on the floor just to get everybody kind of in the same space and on the same page. And I let them know that we are going to be looking at nonfiction. They're getting ready to study nonfiction at that point. And I ask them what kind of nonfiction they like. And I'll often get examples that are like talking about different topics they like to read about. I might have students talk about different series they like to read. I might have students say different sections of the nonfiction section that they like. For example, often have students say, oh, I really like to read cookbooks. And so we'll get all of those different kinds of responses. And I share with them, I'm going to give them a new way to talk about the nonfiction that they love. And we're going to talk about 5 different kinds of nonfiction. And by kinds, I mean formats. I mean the way the writing is and the information in the book is organized, the way that the author decided to organize the information within the book. Now, I'd never give my students on that introductory lesson where they're first getting exposed to it, I never give them the language. Instead, what I do is I love them to build their own definitions. So I send them to 5 different tables in groups of around 4 students, typically each. And on each of those 5 tables, there are 6, 7, 8 examples of that particular kind of nonfiction. And I ask students to spend some time examining those books individually, and I'll put a little timer on so they can do that. And then I ask them to start to try to figure out what's the common element between all of the books that are sitting in front of them, reminding them that it's around how the book is organized, how the information in the book is organized. It's not about the topic. It's definitely not about the series or where exactly it's found in the library. It's all around how that information is organized. And we have our library set up where we have these 5 really large, I shouldn't say really large, they're like 3.5 feet by 5 feet dry erase boards that are on the walls. So we have the kind of these natural groupings where students can then go. And so after students get a chance to talk with each other in these small groups, they then go to the board and they start to write out what are the things that they think are the common elements. What are they seeing with those particular pieces?
I love that idea of giving them that ownership of figuring it out. Working together, I think, is incredibly important, but also just the trying to think about like what is going on here and giving them that agency and that engagement with the process. Because my first impulse would be, okay, look, here's 5 types, here's what they are, here's some examples, go find something you like. So having them take part in the sense making and the knowledge making, I think, is so valuable and important.
Yeah, I think it's in some sense a type of jigsaw essentially, but then with that added layer of definition creating. And this is something that I love to do in a variety of ways, but this particular piece lends itself to it really, really well. Students will collaborate on the boards and get their information down. And as they're doing that, of course, I'm circulating around and checking in with them and helping a little bit, maybe articulate what students are seeing. Maybe they don't always have the language, but they can point to things that they're noticing in common, but they don't know how to articulate it. So I'm helping with those pieces. And as students continue to write on the board, as I continue to check in, I am making sure that they're catching it, the real critical pieces, the real critical things. And then they do essentially a share out. So we come back to the floor where we can kind of see all of those boards, and group by group by group are coming up and they're sharing what they're noticing. Now, that's where really I'm stepping in and doing some of that instruction that you just mentioned, Steve, is there's inevitably going to be gaps. They're not necessarily going to catch everything.
Right.
And so I'm coming in and filling in the gaps, and I'm doing a few other things too. So number one, if they're missing an important element that's really common to see across those books, I'll point that out. I'll more have a conversation with that group out loud for everyone to hear and say, hey, did you notice these elements? For example, in an active nonfiction book, you typically have numbered steps as far as directions, right? If they don't have that element of numbered steps, I'll say, hey, did you notice that a lot of these have numbered steps? And they'll say, of course, yes. And I'll say, hey, I have this book. Did you notice it anywhere else? And they'll pull one up real quick and we'll just kind of confirm, oh, yeah, we're seeing that in multiple places.
Mm-hmm.
I'm adding that information to the board more for time's sake and just to have that visual added in.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing that I'm doing is I'm with kind of color-coded dry erase markers is I'm color coding the things that are unique to that specific kind of nonfiction. And I'm color coding the things that you might see in multiple kinds of nonfiction.
Almost
so
like a color-based Venn diagram almost that we're going to
absolutely. Yeah. And so we get to it in my mind, it points out what's unique about that, but then also what kinds of things we might see in common. And one thing we notice is that we only see that story element, for example, in narrative. Everything else is expository. Everything else is sharing information. And then what I do is at the very end of each group's sharing out and me conferring with that group is I share what kind of nonfiction that is. I give it its name.
Gotcha.
And then students have that information. So we go through, as part of that lesson, each one of those kinds of nonfiction with giving them names and identifying the attributes that they have.
Nice. I love that. And I love too that even though you are the authority in the room, the adult in the room focused on this, you're also very carefully being the guide on the side, letting them take center stage, and only when they need that little bit of extra direction, kind of jumping in and still eliciting from them, here's, what the thing is that we're trying to get to, rather than you just necessarily laying it all out for them.
I love to see those moments where I always describe it kind of jokingly as like, where can I be lazier? Like, where can I step away? But it isn't, because you're, and you know this, I know, but you're always checking in all of the time with these either individuals or small groups, depending on how you have these kinds of structures set up. So that idea of stepping off to the side, letting students own their own elements of their learning and guiding through that process, I think pays such dividends. I really think it's such a great model. And there are times where certainly there's time to just convey information, right? There's times to be that, what's called that sage on the stage kind of thing. But I look for opportunities to exactly kind of step off to the side when I can.
That's great. I love that idea of how can I be lazier? That's a fun way to think about it. Because I mean, I know that it's really actually you're being the opposite of lazy when you're doing those things, because it involves so much more careful one-on-one and small group like supervision and kind of touching base. But from the outside, it looks like you're making the kids do all the work. And in a way, you are making the kids do work, but you're making them do it in a way that I think is so incredibly important for good education, like good learning, to be part of figuring out the answers.
I think it's so much more cerebral because you're figuring out from visual, looking at the group, from coming in and having small conversations, you're looking for all of these cues of what are they getting and what are they not getting, and what is the thing that I can say that's not going to just hand it to them, but it's going to help them discover that piece of information on their own. So you're right, it is so much more work, but I also think it's often the better work to be doing.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So this is all one class period.
This is one class period, and typically my students come in for just 30 minutes, but that class period, we often ask teachers if we can extend by like about 10 minutes. And teachers, we have a kind of a mixed, fixed schedule. So we have opportunities to extend, and we've gotten to the point, thankfully, where not only are students using that language, but teachers are using that language, and teachers are coming up to me and saying during collaboration times or just in between collaboration times, hey, Tom, we're getting close to our nonfiction unit. Can you teach that 5 kinds of nonfiction lesson again? Like, they're looking for it now, which is, to me, that one of 2 tests, right? I'm looking for students to actually learn and then to incorporate that learning, which I mentioned is happening. But when teachers essentially are incorporating that learning or expecting that learning as part of then what students are experiencing also in the classroom, that's when you've got a real beautiful piece of collaboration that is going on between library and classroom learning. And I think, to take a 10,000-foot view, I think those are the moments that make libraries essentials for teachers and administrators often.
Yes.
We all know there's this key role that libraries play for and with students. But I sometimes think that teachers and administrators don't appreciate that as much. And I'm talking about those small moment book connections and the collection development, all those pieces that you and I and our PLN always talk about. But I think that true piece of collaboration where it becomes important to the curriculum in the classroom, teachers value that immensely, administrators value that immensely, and it makes, at least I feel like it makes my library, our library, indispensable, and what we do in that library indispensable to the whole experience of the student.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I love, I mean, I'm picturing this all going on, and I can even imagine at the end of this, maybe there's like a handout or like a bookmark with here's the 5 types that the kids could kind of take with them when they go back to class or something like that as just a reminder.
Let me tell you one even better where we had to get to. Because what happened after we taught this for a couple of years is, of course, students started to incorporate it, and students were coming into the library not for what their teacher was asking for, just for themselves. And they were saying, Mr. Bober, where are the browsable nonfiction books? Mr. Bober, where are the active nonfiction books? Those are the 2 most typical requests. Mr. Bober, where are the narrative or the story nonfiction books? Sometimes they call them. And of course, I had my ones I could quickly identify, like, oh, here's the who would win, not the who would win, that's expository lit. Here's the Weird But True series, as far as browsable. Here's this other series as far as browsable. But I knew I was missing a lot of stuff. So what we did not too long ago is we went through the entire library and we color-coded each of the nonfiction spine labels by the kind of nonfiction that it is.
Nice.
Now, sometimes you'll see a little bit of a mashup, right, within a book, but we had to make a decision one way or the other. So now at the end caps of our nonfiction shelving, we have just a small display that has all those 5 kinds and then the colors that they see on the spine label. So we've tried to make it as usable and as browsable friendly as possible for our students.
Yeah, it's almost like you're genrifying within that nonfiction collection.
That's exactly how we view it, except for it's by that format or structure that of nonfiction. So we have it still organized the same way, right? And we have multiple nonfiction collections, but all of those are organized. For example, our main nonfiction collection is still organized by Dewey. Our biography nonfiction collection, we have that a little subdivided by kind of types of biographies, but then all of those are also labeled, color labeled by the kind of nonfiction that it is.
I've been sort of going back and forth about genrifying. I want to genrify the fiction, and I'm going back and forth about genrifying the nonfiction, but maybe this is the answer to being able to find it on the shelf, but also help the kids find here's the type of nonfiction you might want to pick up.
We found it. The other thing that we've done, and I know this gets a little bit away from the lesson, but we've also then organized, like I mentioned, kind of had these other little subsets of nonfiction. So we, at the elementary level, have a nonfiction picture book section. We have I mentioned a biography section. We have a series section where those books that sit in Dewey would be spread out otherwise. So for our elementary people, Who Would Win, I just mentioned it. Those are spread out, and I always have kids ask for them. So putting them all together and doing that with the different kinds of series, the DK series I mentioned earlier, putting them all together because kids, they get hooked on them and they wanted to read them. And then we also have an oversized nonfiction collection where we have books that are literally like, half as large as some of our children, and they're incredible books, but they don't fit on a regular shelf. So we've made a special physical space to hold all of those. So we have all of these individual types of collections, and then the color coding by the 5 kinds of nonfiction on top of it, plus the Dewey organization. So we almost have like these 3 layers going on of how our nonfiction is organized, and it is complex from a setup point of view. It did take us time to get there, but from a student point of view, my experience is that students are able to really target in on what they're wanting to look for and then to identify that much easier. Doesn't mean they don't ask me for help. They certainly do. Doesn't mean I don't help them search for something on Destiny. I certainly do. But these organizational layers have really added some independence to our students going in and finding what they're wanting to read, or just being able to browse more effectively in the library.
I mean, I think it's a great example of there are sort of standard ways of organizing, and people, say, oh, well, this is the standard that we're going to teach so that wherever the kids go, they get what they need. But within that, you've got to serve your population. And it sounds like you are doing such an amazing job of doing just that, like focusing on the UX, the user experience for the kids. How do we make this the easiest possible library for them to use, which should be the goal, period.
Absolutely. And I was stuck in my own head for a while around exactly what you said, like, oh my goodness, they're going to go to their public library and everything's just going to be organized by Dewey. I'm going to confuse them. No, I'm going to make this easier, because for 9+ months out of the year, for most of my students, this is their library experience. And we need to honor that and make it, as you said, as easy as possible for them to find the books that they want to read. I mean, so I saw it as very much an opportunity. Adding in those layers was, in a way, taking down some barriers that were probably unintentionally in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, we could talk organization for the rest of the week, I'm sure. To just circle it back around a little bit, it sounds like the students are really getting a lot out of this, that they're coming to you and asking for titles based on, or suggestions based on the different types of nonfiction. So it sounds like the student experience has been, or the student response has been very good to this lesson. Have they shared anything else in terms of how they're reacting?
Well, I think exactly what I just said is they're specifically utilizing the terminology, which is what I was hoping for. The other thing that we're doing this year that I think is really exciting is that Melissa Stewart and I are actually working together on a little bit of a study where I am tracking the circulation by grade level, and then we're looking at, of those 5 kinds of nonfiction, how many books are getting checked out at different grade levels. So what is kind of the popularity of those 5 kinds of nonfiction? And I think it's going to be interesting to see. We've obviously have like half a year's worth of data so far, so I'm not going to say anything yet about kind of where it all stands. But there's been some surprises for me around, not that I didn't know what students are checking out, but sometimes until you see the numbers, it doesn't exactly present itself the same. So we're getting kind of this unintentional sharing by students in the sense of looking at their circulation to see what kinds of nonfiction are being checked out the most, what are most popular, and then how do we utilize that along with what you're saying. Obviously when students are asking for stuff, we have that anecdotal data of like, oh, students are really checking these books out, or I'm seeing this grade level always go to this section of nonfiction. But when we are seeing the checkout numbers, when we're seeing what's actually circulating, that's going to give me some more information, and I think really going to help me craft my collection even more towards the needs and the wants of the students in my school.
Love that. Using data collection so that we can make sure we're serving the students the best we can. That's awesome. And it sounds like not only have the students responded to this lesson, but the teachers have too.
Yeah, absolutely. Teachers are utilizing it. And we've had, I'm not saying everybody like right from day one was like on board and, hip, hip, hooray, here's a new thing for me to think about. But teachers have been open and receptive to it. It's allowed us to have some really poignant conversations that I don't think we would have been able to have otherwise, not only about specifically the 5 kinds of nonfiction, but conversations with me about them incorporating more nonfiction into their teaching, into their read alouds, into their classroom. And when I'm able to use like that type of language, it's been helpful. So for example, one of the conversations that I've had with a lot of teachers, especially at the upper elementary grade levels in my school, is around when they do nonfiction writing, what kind of nonfiction writing they're expecting from their students. And sometimes they're expecting something that falls kind of outside of Melissa's purview, right? They're talking about like, well, we want something like a persuasive essay. Okay, well, that's its own thing. But there's also times where for many years, they had been teaching students essentially to write that traditional nonfiction, probably because we think about, essays and that kind of thing. But we are also thinking about students writing creatively and and having their own voice. And so I've been able to lean in and say, this seems like more of an opportunity to encourage or at least allow students to think about writing expository literature and bringing some of these great picture books often in as mentor texts that students can emulate. And so we've made some progress with that. We've brought in nonfiction authors virtually to speak with students about them and their writing, and specific to like some of these kinds of nonfictions. Like that has been a conversation piece. Like, I don't want to just only bring in narrative people. Let's bring in somebody who does expository lit as well. Like we kind of go across the board. And so I think that language has, not only impacted the conversations and the ability to communicate what they want from students, but it's really impacted how teachers are viewing their nonfiction and how teachers and I are collaborating together.
Love it. I would love to see, I'm thinking through all the possibilities here. Like if students had the opportunity to do some instructive nonfiction, they're experts in certain areas that we maybe don't know that much about, and giving them that chance to kind of show their expertise. That could be a fun, sort of a different way of bringing in some nonfiction that maybe the teachers aren't thinking about that as nonfiction, but writing about how you play a video game or writing about how you make a TikTok video or whatever it is, they're going to have some real interesting insights, I think.
Yeah, they do get opportunities to do that at certain grade levels, and I think they're great. I think that element that I keep pushing for is like, okay, well, how are they sharing it? It doesn't necessarily have to be this like chapter breakdown of how to play a video game. It can be a little bit more immersive, but still have that informational element in it with like an expository literature. Or could it be browsable? Can I just have all these little factoids about all these great video games that I love and incorporate that? Like what are the possibilities? And I think that, again, it gives us the language to talk about possibilities.
Oh man, so great. So are there any particular ways that you differentiate or modify this for different groups?
Yeah, so I actually do some version of this from year to year. And so I often don't do the full blown out version that I mentioned. That's typically second grade. Mm-hmm. At younger grades, I've started to incorporate some of the language in, and we kind of talk about how certain books are laid out, although I don't give them the names of the kinds of nonfiction yet, but we'll talk about elements and structure around those books. And then as students get older, often what we're doing is a little more of a revisiting, plus we're going to have new students, plus sometimes I've got new teachers, right? So there's going to be that element going on as well. But typically then it's a little more of a revisit. So we might not do so many like independent investigating and then discussing and then putting on the board and then a sharing out. Like we may condense that a little bit. And so for somebody who needed to condense that because maybe they didn't have the time, we do something where it's like an exploration and a discussion and then a quick sharing out. So that's becomes more condensed. For my students who've already had that experience with it at certain grade levels, and this depends on the group and kind of what I remember from the year prior, but that becomes a way to revisit and refresh our understanding of the 5 kinds of nonfiction, and then an opportunity for me to reiterate the color labeling on all of the books. It's that great opportunity to do that towards the beginning of the year as well. So those lessons that are revisitings typically happen earlier in the year, so I can talk about the color coding organization.
I gotcha. So if somebody's going to try this lesson for the first time, is there anything in particular they should kind of keep in mind as they are prepping?
Yeah, I'd say one thing to keep in mind is when you pull those book examples, I mentioned earlier that sometimes there's like a little mesh up of examples where it will be, for example, traditional structure, but it might have a little more of an informal voice, so it feels a little more expository literature, but it's got more of a traditional, kind of organization, so it feels like a little bit of a mashup to me. Or things where it's sharing information, but it has like that little activity piece at the end of each chapter, so it feels a little like a mix up between traditional and active, for example. So when I'm getting my examples, when we're truly looking at these kinds of nonfiction, I'm getting ones that are really clear cut, that are obvious, and I'm going through them. And I'm also getting books that are short. because I want things that they're going to be able to look at quickly because we simply don't have the time for them to do the deep dive. And plus, the longer books, I think, get a little more complicated when we're trying to think abstractly about the structure of the book itself.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great point. And do you at some point sort of talk to the kids about how sometimes there are crossovers so that they're aware?
Absolutely, because when throughout the year, I'm book talking, right? So whenever I'm book talking, I'm book talking as much nonfiction as I am fiction, and inevitably, I'm also talking about structure. So those are the opportunities for me to say, oh, it's got a little bit of this and a little bit of that, kind of mixed together within the book.
That totally makes sense. Oh man, so many great points, so many great things that I am going to absolutely steal and work into my own nonfiction lesson. I really appreciate that. We're going to go in a completely different direction now, and we are going to have our book break.
Book break! Squiddly!
So, for the book break, any kind of book you want to share, it could be personal, professional, for the students, for the staff, for yourself, whatever, anything at all. What's a book that you want people to be aware of?
Okay, well, you would think I would be telling you about a piece of nonfiction after that whole talk, but I'm actually going to tell you a piece of fiction because it is, I think, my favorite thing that I read in 2023. And so even though we're early in 2024, I'm like still thinking about it, especially with the Youth Media Awards around the corner. And I'm crossing my fingers that it gets some kind of shiny medal on it. But my favorite thing that I read in 2023 was a middle grade fiction novel called The Labors of Hercules, Beal, and it's by Gary Schmidt. It is a beautiful book where, for me at least, when I'm talking to this book to my students, I'm talking to them about the fact that this is a story about a character who is dealing with the death of his parents, but he's also dealing with kind of how things look for the future with him and his brother, his older brother, that they are kind of co-running a business, and how he's existing in the present, dealing with the new school that he's at and the challenges at that school and the monstrous year-long assignment that his teacher has given him, which is to emulate or follow the, I think, 13 labors of Hercules from mythology. And because his name is Hercules as well. And so through him trying to make connections between these 13 labors, these 13 adventures, and his own life, he kind of uncovers all these amazing things about himself. So I tell my students it's very much this journey story where someone's having a personal journey in their own life. But the thing that I love about the book is the voice of the character. And I also love the fact that within the same chapter multiple times, I laughed and I got teared up at the same chapter.
Wow.
Like when that can happen, when I can have a book make me feel something like that, plus the writing is amazing, like that is a winner for me. So it's my favorite thing of 2023, favorite book of 2023. And it's becoming, as I get students to read it, I think a favorite that's going to be on the shelves for a long time in my library.
I think I've seen that title pop up here and there, and I haven't given enough attention, clearly, because it sounds like a real amazing title. That's going on the TBR pile.
I feel like I've noticed when I was talking this up so much in November and December and now in January, I've come to just acknowledge that I really, for whatever reason, connect. I don't know if it's connect because that didn't happen to me when I was young, but I really appreciate stories where the main character has parents who have passed away. Like that trauma element and the ability to investigate like deep feelings through that type of story is something, for whatever reason, that just really resonates with me. So I have students too that love a good sad story.
Oh yeah.
And this fits the bill.
Love it. Okay, definitely getting that on my list. Cool. Well, if people want to catch up with you online to find out more about nonfiction or whatever else you've got going on, because you've got so many great things going on, where are they going to find you?
Okay, so on the socials, my handle is at Captain Library, and I'm on Bluesky and Instagram and X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok. And you can also find me, I have a podcast out, so it's called the Primary Source Podcast, and we talk about primary sources. And more often than not, we end up interviewing authors of nonfiction books, and we talk about how primary sources influence the work that they do.
I love it. Man, what a great resource your podcast is for all of us to help us find great materials and to really make those connections between primary sources and what students are doing in school. Because I think that's an easy one to overlook sometimes.
Lots of good payoffs for that. It's really some really powerful tools out there.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and I cannot wait to dive into this lesson with my own kids.
Steve, thanks for having me.
Thanks for checking out this episode of the SLLN podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes, which include not only a link to the lesson, but also links to the SLLN website, home to a curated list of free upcoming virtual events and resources for school librarians. It's easy to become a member of the network. Just visit the site and use what you like. If you have an idea, a question, or a lesson you want to share, you can email schoolliblearning@gmail.com. That's school, L-I-B, learning@gmail.com. Know someone with a great school library lesson? Let us know. Until next time, be safe, be good, and be well.